viewers out there. So for this video, instead of my usual subject of math, I'm going to talk about American history instead. And my motivation for making this video is I often think that the reason many students don't learn American history is they tend to get bombarded with facts, names, dates, places, and the process is sort of like trying to drink out of a fire hose or fill a teacup with a fire. You're just not going to get too much information or retain much information when it's coming at you in such large volumes. So I decided that what I wanted to do is to just sort of put American history into a nutshell and turn it into a nice, easy to understand story that hopefully will be easier for people to understand. I think that's one of the main reasons why there are studies or sort of surveys where they talk about how ignorant Americans are of their own history. They'll say the average American can't correctly identify the century the Civil War was fought in, or some such or similar examples like that. So I'm going to try and boil down American history to the very basics. Now, any discussion of history is by necessity going to have to leave things out. You can't talk about everything. You talk all day. So I'd say that history, to a large extent, and I'll be writing this in a happy blue marker instead of my usual black one. So history basically boils down, I would say, to two major components. First, we have nations, how they form, how they interact with other nations, how they grow and thrive, and how they decay and collapse. And that's largely due to the policies of their governments. So the history of nations is mostly the history of their governments. And the second big part of history, I'd say, is ideas. So that includes, religion, philosophy, and so on. Well, I've never been good at judging the amount of space I have when I'm writing something. So religion, philosophy, science, etc. That's what I mean by ideas there. So going back to American history, American history is largely the result of European history. So suppose if you wanted to be, it's arbitrary where you would start the story, but I would start it at about the year 1500. So about the year 1500, what was happening in Western Europe is this was about the time the major nations of Europe were beginning to form and coalesce out of the tiny, smaller kingdoms that had prevailed through most of the Middle Ages. So these newer nations included, England, Spain, Portugal, France. And the Netherlands were the major important nations about the year 1500. And the historians or history buffs might take exception to the Netherlands, which I believe did not technically gain independence until the mid-1500s, but about this time these nations were growing in power and prosperity. And in particular, about this time in the year 1500, we have the rivalry between Spain and Portugal. Portugal was quick out of the gate in this era when it comes to seafaring and discovery. So, Portugal had the lead when it came to exploring and colonizing. But Spain caught up fairly quickly, and we ended up with a rivalry between the two. In fact, the rivalry became so intense that there was a treaty, I believe it was 1494, it was the Treaty of Tordesillas. In that treaty, the Pope divided the world between Spain and Portugal, basically. So what happened is, and the treaty was revised various times over the years. But the net result of it was Spain got most of South America and parts of North America. While Portugal maintained colonies in Africa and Asia. I guess I should say, just abbreviate that. Astute viewers will note that Portugal did later gain some control of Brazil, and as I said, this Treaty of Tordesillas was broken and rewritten and amended a number of times over the centuries. But that's the gist of it there. So we have this rivalry between Spain and Portugal. They're exploring. They establish colonies in various places. And that goes on for about a century until we get to the year 1588. In the year 1588, something very important happened. We had the defeat of the Spanish Armada by the English. So the Spanish sent a fleet, an armada, to Britain with the intent of invading and installing a king who would be friendly to Spain's interests. And the fleet was destroyed by the English Navy, and this was the beginning of the rise of England as a naval power. So now that England is confident on the seas, it too begins to explore. England ends up establishing colonies in what is now the eastern part of the United States. Establishes colonies in North America starting in the 1600s. Now in school or when I was in school, they would talk about Jamestown and Plymouth and go into fairly detailed accounts of each of these colonies. I don't think that's really necessary. It's just to put it in a nutshell, England starts establishing colonies in North America in the 1600s. That's the gist of it. And everything's honky-dory, more or less, for a century or so. There are wars between the English colonists and the native tribes, plus a few smaller wars with the other European powers. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the various wars, but there are a number of wars between 1600 and the founding of the United States. I'm not going to dwell too much on that. Another thing I should note is the Europeans brought smallpox with them when they came to the New World. And that disease of smallpox wiped out a large percentage of the natives. So one of the reasons why the Spanish were able to conquer the Aztecs and the Incas so easily is the smallpox that they brought with them spread, and that wiped out large sections of those of their population and made them easier to fight. I suppose with the Aztecs, smallpox was not as much an issue, but with the Incas it certainly was. Okay, so then we come to pivotal year, about 1754. So this year we have the 7 Years' War in Europe. Which in North America was called the French and Indian War. So the main rivals in North America at this time were the French and the English. So some of the native tribes sided with the French, others sided with the English. They fought it out. And the net result was that England was victorious. And they get Canada, which up until that time had been a French territory. But like all wars, it cost a lot of money. So the cost of the French and Indian War got dumped on the colonists in North America. And there was, of course, protests about this. So, to pay for this war, various taxes were imposed on the colonists, and this is where you start to hear the grumblings of revolution, the phrase, no taxation without representation. So the colonists were not against taxes in principle, they just said they didn't want to pay taxes without getting a say in how they got spent. And so this grumbling continued until the founding fathers, they organized a revolt, which became the American Revolution. So before they began their revolt, or the act of the revolt, was the Declaration of Independence. Which is basically just a long list of complaints about the way the colonies have been treated. Just complaints about taxes and so on. So we have the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War. It's America early on was not doing very well. Without the French helped, and also owing to the tenacity of George Washington. So I could say GW is a steady leader. I could say GW's leadership, because he was a decent military commander. And independence was gained. And that was about, I believe it was 1783 that the armistice was signed, or the agreement where Britain, or I should say England, granted America its independence. So we have a new nation. So this takes us to about the 1780s and 90s. So at this time, the nation was just a loose association of states. So there was no strong central government yet. And that caused various problems, such as low taxes, revolts. There was a Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts, and what happened there was a farmer named Daniel Shays. He was in debt, so his farm was going to be repossessed, and so he figured that if he attacked the courthouse and prevented this order from being sent, he would keep his farm. And other farmers got the same idea, and there was a rebellion, and this shook the confidence of the nation. It's like, how can we have a peaceful nation if people are going around starting rebellions? So the original basic law of the country was the Articles of Confederation. The problem with those, too weak. Basically, that was a problem. The central government was too weak under the Articles of Confederation. So a new document was drawn up mostly by James Madison, so the father of the Constitution. And the main ideas that influenced him were ideas of the Enlightenment in Europe. And so the Enlightenment was a period in Europe that lasted from about 1600 to 1800, roughly. And it was a period where traditional sources of authority, such as the church and the king, were beginning to be doubted, and people, or thinkers, were trying to come up with new ideas about how laws should be, what kind of laws there should be, how society and government should be organized, that kind of thing. There's a period of new ideas. So out of those new ideas, we have the separation of powers, which I believe was an idea from John Locke, who was a philosopher in England in about that period. And this came to be embodied in the Constitution in a concept known as checks and balances. Another influential thinker was a Frenchman named Montesquieu, who he wrote a book called The Spirit of Laws. And his ideas were also influential in the writing of the Constitution. So, the Constitution comes along, which makes the central government that much stronger. But to guard against tyranny, the government is divided into 3 branches. And each branch can overrule another branch or not sure how you spell overrule. So I'll just say counter other branches in certain areas. So a good example of this is the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, so he's in charge of the military. However, only Congress is allowed to declare a war. Another example of this is Congress can write laws, but the president can either approve them or veto them, and Congress can again override that veto with I believe it's a 3/4 vote. And the Supreme Court too has powers. It can it can declare unconstitutional laws, if it can declare laws to be unconstitutional and have them struck down. So each branch of government has its own powers, and I don't want to spend too much time on that, though it's a civics lesson for, I suppose, another video. So after we have the Constitution, we have a period from about 1800 to 1830. So this is a period marked by the expansion of the country. So we have growth, expansion, new states. I'm not going to touch too much on the War of 1812 because its historical consequences are pretty minor. I mean, I heard a joke that the main result of the War of 1812 was the Star-Spangled Banner. So there was no territory gained or lost. The main thing is the United States and England basically agreed to leave each other's stuff alone. So that's all there was to it, pretty much. And so we had wars with the Indian tribes. There was the construction of the Erie Canal, and that was the main events of that period. Suppose I should also, I skipped this when I was talking, I should have mentioned this in the earlier section, the issue of slavery. So in the beginning, slavery was legal in all colonies. Then later on, some abolished it. Those are the northern ones. And the southern ones kept it and depended on it. And this caused a problem during the writing of the Constitution, because one of the issues during the writing of the Constitution was how the national legislature would be organized. So there was the larger states wanted proportional population. So in other words, the larger the population, the more representatives. And smaller states, those were largely the ones, smaller states, north or south. They wanted even representation, so every state gets the same number of representatives. And so what happened was there was a compromise, and the compromise says that, okay, so the national legislature, called the Congress, would have two houses. So they'd have the House of Representatives, which would be based on population, and then the Senate, where each state would get 2 senators. And then, going back to slavery, there was a clause, and this clause is still in the Constitution. It was struck down by later amendments, obviously, but it was the 3/5 clause, which said that in the slave states, each slave would count as a 3/5 of a person for population purposes. So there was an argument about whether to count the slaves in the population of the state. The non-slave state says, well, it's not really fair to count the slaves in your population since they can't vote. And the slave states complained, and they argued back and forth, and finally they came to a compromise that says, okay, we'll count the slaves, but only, let's say a slave is 3/5 of a person. So that was the 3/5 clause. And another compromise they came to about slavery was the 50-year compromise, which said that they weren't going to pass any laws regarding slavery for 50 years. Or sorry, not 50, it was a 20-year compromise, I believe. My mistake. So this takes us back, we're getting into the period from about 1830 to 1850. So still expansion going on during this time. There's a lot of territory taken from Mexico. So first in 1836, I believe Texas declared independence from Mexico, and then it later became a state, I believe in, I want to say 1840, no, I'm not sure at the date, but Texas became a state in the 1840s, I want to say 1845. So he seized all this western territory. And so this led to a conflict where, since there were an even number of slave and free states, there was an argument about how these with these new territories, when they became states, would they be slave states or free states? And so there was, both sides wanted to shift the balance in their favor. And so this tension about what to do with the new territories is one of the main reasons for the Civil War. And it's important to point out that about this time, the slave trade had been outlawed, so there are no new slaves coming to the U.S. I can't remember the exact date the slave trade was outlawed. I want to say about the 1830s the British decided to stop slave ships from coming out of West Africa. I suppose as kind of a minor digression, the reason the slaves were taken in the first place was, as I said before, the smallpox epidemic wiped out most of the native tribes. So the colonists who wanted, labor for their plantations, there weren't enough settlers. That deserves its own little screen, I suppose. It's a little out of order, but since we're talking about slavery, I can talk a little bit about the origin. So, the slave trade started So it started around 1600. And the reason that the slave trade started was a couple of reasons. One, not enough labor. So one of the ways they tried to attract labor was with something called indentured servitude. Which was a process where people from Europe would agree to work on someone's plantation for say 7 years, and then that would pay for their passage to the New World. So if you signed up to be an indentured servant, you got a free trip to the colonies, which you had to work on some guy's farm for 7 years. And of course, the smallpox epidemic killed off so many Indians, so they couldn't really take them for slaves either. So as a result, the only really source left for slaves was West Africa. And without spending too much more time on that, I guess the other last thing I'll say is slavery was pretty much universal until about 200 years ago, and people of all races have been enslaved throughout the years and the eras. But the slavery that came to America had an interesting new dimension. It had racism added to it. So in order to justify their enslavement of the black Africans they brought, they had to come up with this idea that they were inferior, and so it was okay to enslave them. So it was also sort of the beginning of anti-black racism as a result of slavery. We'll just put a note for that there. So all this talk about slavery brings us to the Civil War. Some purists will argue that there were other factors involved in the Civil War, and there were, but the main factor was slavery. So the increasing tension between the slave states and the free states over the future of slavery caused the slave states to break away. So the slave states they feared the abolition of slavery, which would have wrecked their economies, since their economies were based on agriculture and hence slave labor. Particularly crops like cotton. So all this talk of abolishing slavery made them nervous. So in 1861, they declared it that a number of states seceded. So this was the beginning of the Civil War. Now the Civil War, as far as military history goes, there's a wealth of very interesting and dramatic history there. about the battles and commanders and strategies and whatnot. But as I'm trying to put American history into a nutshell, I'll leave it simply as the North won, that the North or Free States won, and the Southern, I guess I should say, but Southern states. So North wins due to superior manpower and industrial capacity. And the President of the United States during the Civil War, one of the more famous, influential presidents, was Abraham Lincoln. So Abe Lincoln was primarily responsible for the victory. And he wanted to be gracious in victory, though, to help mend the country together without too much bitterness. Unfortunately, he was assassinated, and his more hardline vice president, Andrew Johnson, took over. And so Reconstruction was a lot more, the South was treated much more harshly as a result, and there was a lot more bitterness that came as a result of that. Let's see. So as a result of the harsh Reconstruction policies, the South set up a number of anti-black laws, Jim Crow laws they were called, which restricted the rights of the newly freed slaves. So although slavery was abolished, the former slave states posed a number of anti-black laws, or I guess they just say racist laws. Make it a little easier. So that takes us through Reconstruction mostly. So this takes us to about the period of 1870 to 1890. And this was a period characterized by immigration. So America's economy was booming, so many new people were coming. You had a booming economy. There was one big financial crisis in the 1870s, but otherwise it was a very prosperous time. Growth in technology. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed, the telephone was invented, a number of other advancements. And the nickname for this era was Gilded Age. There was a fair amount of, and it's so called because of the corruption in politics, the spoils system, cronyism, that kind of thing. And it was also during that period that just go ahead and 1870 to 1890. The last of the Indians were defeated. And forced onto reservations. And so by about 1890, the whole of the continental U.S., the whole was under American control. So it was a U.S. controlled all the land between the oceans. So this takes us to the next period, which lasts about 1890 to 1910. So this was America's era of imperialism. So the U.S. acquired a number of territories abroad and concessions. So from Spain, we gained control of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. Cuba and the Philippines later gained their independence, but Puerto Rico is still a U.S. territory. And even then, the U.S. exerted quite a bit of influence over Cuba and Philippines during the next 50-odd years or so. And also in China, the U.S. had trading interests there. And this, along with a number of other European nations, and this led to the Boxer Rebellion. So a group of nationalists in China who were nicknamed the Boxers because of the exercises they did, they attacked all the foreigners in their nation and tried to drive them out. They were unsuccessful, and foreign domination of China continued more or less all the way up through World War II. That's a story for another video. The history of China, at least. Okay, so now we have World War I. The U.S. gets involved in that in 1917. The war itself began in 1914. The U.S. did not get involved until 1917. So the U.S. helps defeat the Central Powers, which was Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, I should say. And this war, I suppose, marked the beginning of the U.S. as a serious global power. In the interwar years, not long after, in 1918, we have Prohibition. So there was a movement called the Temperance Movement that sought to ban alcohol for the various harms they saw it cause, and this resulted in a wave of crime. And most people kept drinking anyway. But I mention this because Prohibition, together with two other amendments that were passed in this time, helped to grow the U.S. government. And this was the result of a political movement called the Progressives. So in the 1910s, you had the Progressive movement. Which sought to expand the government in order to help the common people. And so one of their policies is they helped push through the income tax, which levied a tax on wealthy people, and that was the first tax of its kind, an income tax in the U.S. history. Yeah, just help people. Also, about this time, you have the passage of the FDA came into being. A number of other government agencies. The 18th Amendment was also part of the progressive movement in a way. You have the direct election of U.S. senators, which I believe was the 16th Amendment. Yes, so that was the 16th Amendment. So the whole point of the progressive movement was to expand the power of the government to help the people, and also to grant more power to the individual voters. But it was mostly about expanding the power of the central government. It's also about this time brought about the creation of the Federal Reserve, which marked the beginning of the U.S. government exerting increased influence over the economy. Okay, so then in the 1920s, despite Prohibition, we have prosperity for the most part. There was a depression in 1920 that often gets overlooked. And it was a pretty big stock market crash, but it went away in a year. And the federal government did not do a whole lot there. And that was all about to change. We have another big crisis. So in 1929 we have a stock market crash, and that led to the Great Depression. And as a result of the crisis, FDR gets elected, promising change and hope. Hope and change, sound familiar? Perhaps I shouldn't get too political. I believe the actual slogan of his campaign was the New Deal, or rather that was the set of programs he launched. We could talk about that next. So the New Deal programs include a number of greatly increased spending, work programs, I guess you could call them economic laws, wage and price controls, all kinds of crazy programs like that. And it was mostly a failure. Pretty much the only New Deal program that survives today is Social Security, which began in 1935. That's, I guess, aside from FDR's involvement in World War II, is his main legacy. That brings us to our next topic. So over in Europe, so Germany suffered because of the Treaty of Versailles, which was the treaty that ended World War I. And because of this treaty, Germany had to pay enormous sums of money to France and Britain and the other victorious nations in World War I. And then when the Depression hit, their economy really went into a tailspin. And this anger and resentment led to the rise of the Nazi Party. And a similar thing happened in Italy with Mussolini and the fascists. Now we're getting to stuff that I think most people are more familiar with. Everybody knows who Hitler was and who the Nazis were. We have to turn once again to the Far East. So over in Asia, Japan, from about 1870 to 1930, had been modernizing technology-wise and colonizing it and conquering its neighbors, particularly like Korea, parts of China, and so on. Now, beginning in the late 1930s, the U.S. began to take a dim view of Japan's expansion and impose sanctions on them. One of the things you realize when you look at history is sanctions are almost always a prelude to war, and this was probably the most classic example I can think of to punish Japan's aggression. And what was the result of that? Well, Japan responded to these sanctions and embargoes by attacking Pearl Harbor in 1941. And their plan was to score a quick and decisive victory to force the U.S. into negotiations. It didn't work. But since Japan and Germany had allied a few years earlier, because when Japan attacked the U.S. declared war, and as a result, Germany declared war on the U.S., and the U.S. declared war on Germany. So World War II is on now. Now, World War II began in 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. So Germany invaded Poland. Well, actually, before 1939, Germany had been conquering various territories that it had lost as a result of World War I. And in 1939, they decided to go ahead and go full hog and attack Poland. And when Germany invaded Poland, France and Britain declared war on Germany, and that was the beginning of World War II there. The U.S., as I said earlier, didn't get involved until 1941. So the gist of World War II is when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, which was their big mistake. And the Soviets pretty much defeat Germany through attrition. They had far more men than they could, far more men, tanks, guns, everything. They were getting, they did not do very well in the early years of the war. They suffered gigantic losses, but slowly but surely they built up strength and defeated the Germans. Over in the Pacific theater, and I know I'm glossing over all the major theaters of war, but like I said, I'm trying to put American history into a nutshell. In the Pacific, it's pretty much the same deal. U.S. defeats Japan through attrition. The U.S. had an island hopping campaign. So the Japanese had captured a number of islands in the Pacific, so the U.S. just invaded and captured those islands one by one and pushed them back that way. And then when the Japanese had been beaten all the way back to their home islands, we were bombing them, and they finally surrendered after the 2 atomic bombs were dropped on them. So that brings World War II to an end. So Germany, Japan, Italy was also one of the Axis powers. So the Axis was defeated. And the Axis was mainly Germany and Japan. And as a result of this led to a new international organization, the United Nations, the UN, which replaced the League of Nations, which had been formed in the aftermath of World War I. And also, as a result of World War II, this was the beginning of the Cold War between the US and the USSR, the Soviet Union. To understand that, well, I suppose I should have, when I was talking about World War I should have mentioned that one of the outcomes of World War I was the formation of the Soviet Union. So during World War I, the Russian Empire, or simply Russia, was on the same side as France, Britain, and the United States. And the Russians were suffering terrible losses in World War I, and as a result the communists took advantage of the discontent to overthrow the Tsar's government and establish a new nation. And in the interwar, in the time between the Russian Revolution in 1917 and World War II, there was hostile relations between the U.S. and the USSR. During World War II, since we were on the same side, they improved briefly, and then after the war was over, it went back to hostility. So the two main crises of the Cold War, there was the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. And so what happened there was Korea had been occupied by Japan during World War II. After the war ended, the occupation of Korea was split between the U.S., the United States, and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union gave support to a communist dictator in the northern part that they occupied. His name was Kim Il-sung. The North Koreans invaded the south. They tried to conquer it. The U.S. and the UN pushed them back, and the war pretty much ended in a stalemate. So we still have North and South Korea today. And then later there was the Vietnam War, which, depending on how you look at it, America started getting involved in the mid-50s. So for America's involvement, it was about 1954 to 1973. So it was about 20 years, give or take. And that, of course, was ended in the communists taking over all of Vietnam. So like Korea, Vietnam had been occupied by the Japanese. And then after the war, it returned to France. France had been controlling Vietnam since the late 1800s. the communists in Vietnam fought off the French, and then the country was divided between a communist north and a non-communist south. And then, like Korea, the communists in the north attacked and were trying to unify the country. The U.S. gave help to the anti-communist forces in the south, but it was not enough, and the communists eventually won. I suppose, so the Cold War is about 1950 to 1990, and that's pretty much the highlights of it there. And I guess I could talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that, but I'm trying to put it in a nutshell here. Okay, so then we have the 1950s and 1970s. You have a bunch of social movements. You have the Civil Rights Movement, which sought to end segregation and all the racist laws in the South. And that's where it brings in Martin Luther King and all those guys. And so they succeed, and the Congress passes the Civil Rights Act and a number of other laws to combat prejudice. And that was the main result of the Civil Rights Movement. Closer to the 1970s, we have the rise of feminism. Now, feminism kind of slowly built up. The women got the right to vote in 1920, and then during World War II, when all the men were sent off to fight, women chipped in factories and began to enter the workforce in large numbers. And so, and then when the war ended and the men came back home, there was kind of, I guess, a discontent, sort of. And all these women who had been, working were now, sent back to be stay-at-home moms or whatever. And there's kind of a resentment building around that. And then by the time the 1970s get around, feminism's in full bloom, and there's talk of the Equal Rights Amendment, and so on and so forth. So feminism, another social movement born out of this era. You have the environmental movement. I guess I should just say environmentalism. So this was largely due to the work of a woman named Rachel Carson. She wrote a book called Silent Spring about the dangers of an insecticide called DDT, and that led to the DDT being banned in the U.S. And in many other countries with not so great results, but that's a story for another video. Some successes, though, the environmentalist movement are the EPA was formed, which set various controls on pollution, which helped combat acid rain. And another result of the environmentalist movement was an international agreement banning CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which are used in air conditioning and refrigeration and hairspray, or they were used for a long time. Those were banned, which was good because those chemicals do punch holes in the ozone layer. So environmentalism, kind of a mixed bag. The other two, I'd say they're more or less on the whole beneficial. Okay, so that takes us through the social movements there. The 70s and the 80s, it's just the Cold War drags on, more of the same. Not too much going on in those 2 decades. Communism, the USSR collapses in 1991. And about this time, China had been communist China had been liberalizing prior to this. I suppose I should have talked about how during the Cold War, China too became communist. But as time went on, they're pretty much communist in name only. That's pretty much the end of communism. And then this post-Cold War era, this ushers in the era of globalization. So now that all these walls have been knocked down, you have a great growth in trade, and of course, the coming of the internet revolutionized communication and commerce. So that's mostly the period of the 90s and the early 2000s. So we're getting pretty close to the present now. So what is characterized by this era? Well, I guess the biggest issues America's been facing is Mideast turmoil and terrorism. You know, the Mideast turmoil and terrorism involving America, it began, I guess you could trace it back to the 1980s when we had the U.S. had its problems with Gaddafi, and then the first Gulf War, and then there's also the trouble with Iran. So that the Mideast turmoil dates back to 1970s, 1980s. It starts to boil over starting in the 1990s with the Al-Qaeda attacks, and finally, by the time the September 11th attacks roll around, we have this new war on terror which was launched, and that's been pretty much the main focus of the United States of these past 10 years or so. And so that pretty much takes us through American history in a nutshell. So I guess I'll wrap things up with talking a little bit about what the future holds and trends we've seen over time. So the main trend is the growth of government and taxes, spending, and regulation. And the government is far larger and more powerful than it was even 100 years ago. And this is largely a legacy of the Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War. So that's the big trend we've had over the past 100 years or so. And I guess the main challenge America has for the future is, given the amount of debt we've been racking up, it's not a major trend, a huge growth in debt. So the main choice or problem America will be facing is how to adjust to, well, how can I put this? How to preserve its prosperity. Because, of course, also during this time, the U.S. has been increasingly shifting away from an industrial manufacturing-based economy to a service-based one. Exports have been declining. Many other trends that aren't so great. So the key question America faces for the future is how to preserve its prosperity. And I suppose I'll end it there. That's my American history in a nutshell. I'm sure there are things I know there are important things that I left out, but like I said, I'm just trying to get this into a somewhat short and coherent story, and this is the story I think makes the most sense. So thanks for watching, and I'll be throwing up more history. Well, perhaps I shouldn't say throwing up more history. I will be posting more history videos in the near future.